Life Imprints Podcast. Legacy stories that live beyond. Turn up the volume on today's riveting story with your host, Kenny Mauck, at kennymauck.com. And leave your life imprint with your legacy story.
Well, we are so excited about him. Number one, he's the real deal. I've met him. You know, he's a very personal person, and I'm just honored to interview him. I've been amazed from a distance, but to get close with him and hear him speak today is a really great opportunity. Your book is True Faith and Allegiance that Ken Abraham, the guy I was just meeting with. He's done your book, and you lay out some really neat things that happen in the book. And one of the things that I think that's really great is just knowing about your family, and I can relate to that. My family was farmers. They came from a farming situation, and yet I went all the way back to 733, and one was in the Civil War, one was actually in the World War II, and so it's kind of interesting to go back to your family and realize, wow, there's legacy here that I didn't even know about. I didn't do the study, but you know, since Ancestry and some of the other sites of research, you can go back and actually understand what your family. And so I've been doing the catharsis and therapeutic walkthrough with my own story. But it's great to hear you know, that you came from a family that didn't have a lot of means. At first, and but very hardworking parents, and you know, knowing that they had a 2-bedroom home and yet 8 kids, that's pretty phenomenal story in itself. You know, you were with 3 brothers, and then your sisters were there, the 4 sisters, and the mom and dad, they showed the example of what, standing out in the living room probably and bedded down, right? Is that the kind of the way it was?
Yes, their bedroom was the living room. So it's a great story. It's the American story, and as I travel the country, I meet so many people that have similar stories. I'm reminded, I was at a dinner a few years ago where I was speaking, and I was helping to give an award to Edward James Olmos, the fine Latin actor. And I began my remarks by telling my story, growing up in a small 2-bedroom house, 8 kids, 10 of us in total, et cetera, telling this story. So Olmos gets up, and he begins by talking about growing up in a house that didn't even have a floor. So that was the lesson I think he was trying to tell me, hey, you had it right. That's right. But it really is true. So many of us, that is what's so great about our country, is the opportunities that are given to all of us if we simply get an education and work hard, apply ourselves, take advantage of opportunities, and look what can be accomplished. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, well, you have an very amazing story. I wanted to ask you, first of all, you were the 80th Attorney General of the United States. I found out that, and you also, in terms of, you are I think, if I'm not mistaken, the highest-ranking Hispanic official in the United States in terms of the government. Is that correct?
Yeah, in terms of the executive branch. And by terms of cabinet rank, the Department of Justice is generally viewed as the 4th highest ranking cabinet position, behind State, Treasury, and Defense.
Yeah.
And obviously we have a Hispanic on the U.S. Supreme Court. That's a very important position as well. But in terms of within the executive branch, yes, I've held the highest position.
What did Mom think of that?
You know, it's funny. My mom's was often interviewed, particularly when I first went to work in the White House as White House counsel. And she was always asked by the media, "Well, aren't you proud of your son?" And my mom always responded with the perfect answer, which was, "I'm proud of all of my children." And that's that's the way she was and is, and she's still alive today. She just turned 86 a few days ago. But I've had a remarkable life. I think. And I'm really, really proud that my mom has lived so long to see all of this. My dad died during my last semester in law school, and I'd like to think he'd be very proud of the opportunities that I've had and the things that I've done.
Yeah, you came from a great work ethic of your father and mom. I want to skip forward a little bit to, or maybe back, 9/11. You know, it's coming up, and the 17 years since that happened. You had a bird's eye view that very few of us in America had, Judge Gonzales. And so it'd be great to hear in our podcast today, what was it like to be there, when all of a sudden the rest of us are spellbound watching on TV all of this. Where were you, and where was the cabinet? Then after you tell that's how you and George Bush actually figured it out where to get together.
Well, I was not in the cabinet. I was White House counsel, so I was on the president's staff on 9/11. But I began my day by flying out of Dulles Airport about 7:30 in the morning. And the reason I mention that is because flight American 77 flew out of Dulles the same morning, within an hour of my flight, and that's the same airplane that was hijacked and crashed into the Pentagon. So I was in the terminal the same time as the hijackers, and I've always wondered about whether or not my path crossed with them. Did I ever see them? But I'll never know. Oh. Anyway, I was at the airport flying to Norfolk, Virginia to give a speech, and when I arrived at the hotel, the first tower had been hit, and my deputy was in the Situation Room and called me, and we talked about it. We thought it was maybe an airplane. Commercial airplane, didn't know really what was happening. So I gave my speech, and when the speech was over, the second tower had been hit, so we knew immediately we were under attack. We knew immediately it was Al-Qaeda. That summer in the National Security Council meetings, we'd had a lot of discussions about Al-Qaeda threats, but we always assumed it would be outside the United States, not within our borders. But we knew immediately on 9/11 it was Al-Qaeda. So here I am in Norfolk, and the president is in Florida, and I decide I've got to get back to Washington. I've got to be back at my post before the commander-in-chief returns. That was my mission. Oh. And we're stranded there. We go to the airport. By the time we get there, I was traveling with one of my lawyers. By the time we got there, the air traffic had been canceled, and so I'm stranded. And we ran into a Navy officer, and she said, I can take you to Norfolk Naval Station. Maybe they can help you. So she took me there. They took me to the base commander, and I said, identify myself. I said, please try to get me back to Washington. So I watched the towers fall, sitting at the base on a television like every other American. We tried to account for our lawyers. I wanted to make sure my deputy was in charge of making sure all the legal issues that had to be dealt with were being dealt with. And then finally, late afternoon, I got word the Navy got clearance to fly me back to Washington on a Navy helicopter. Got back about 2:30. They took me to an underground bunker where Cheney was at and the other senior members of the administration. The president had not yet returned. I worked on issues related to legal authorities of the president during this kind of situation. At about 7 o'clock, we got word the president was going to be arriving on Marine One. So I went out to the Oval Office porch with Karen Hughes, the communications director. Karen and I had worked for Bush in Texas, so we knew him really well. And we watched as Marine One brought him home. And, when people ask me of all the experiences, the things that you remember the most, what stands out, it is that moment, watching the Marine One bring President Bush home that historic day. Wow. We knew, I really wanted to see his face because I knew him pretty well. And we greeted him as he approached us. He didn't say a word. He just kind of nodded and walked right by us. Behind the Oval Office is a small study and a small dining room. We went into the dining room. We were met there by Andy Card, the chief of staff, Condi Rice, national security advisor, and Ari Flesch, the press secretary. And there the president began thinking out loud, okay, we're at war. What are we going to do? We talked about what he was going to say in his speech to the nation that night. And I remember going home about midnight. My deputy took me home because my car was in the same lot as some of the terrorists. Apparently, all the cars had been impounded, so I didn't have transportation. Whoa. And then the next day, we arrived about 6 in the morning back at the White House, and it was a brand new world.
Wow, yeah.
That was my day.
Wow. Yeah. Were you able to communicate that following day with the president?
Oh, sure. Yeah. As you might imagine, the next day, his day was slammed with meeting after meeting after meeting. And I was in a lot of those meetings.
You were his chief counsel. Right?
I was telling you the story. He kept talking about being at war. We were at war in these meetings, and the lawyer in me started thinking, well, now if we're at war, it's going to trigger statutes, a statutory authority. It's going to probably trigger treaty obligations. It might affect private contracts. So maybe we should not say we're at war until we really look at this thing. And so I took him aside after one of these meetings, and I explained to him why we might not want to say just yet that we're at war. And he kind of looked at me like, are you crazy? He said, you lawyers can call it whatever you want to. As far as I'm concerned, we're at war. And that's the last time we ever had that conversation, I can assure you. But yeah, his days was slammed with meeting after meeting. And of course, that weekend, all of us went up to Camp David, and we spent the weekend up there going through all the legal issues and going through everything else, intelligence and defense, Treasury. I mean, it was all hands on deck, certainly for those first few weeks and months. It was pretty intense.
Wow. Well, yeah, go for a little further. You know, I know they got a movie on this, but I guess when the president does his annual speech at the beginning of the year, all of a sudden, you know, they put you up in a plane, right? Because you're going to be that one that's
the designated survivor.
Yeah, right.
It's part of our continuity government plan to make sure that at any one time there is someone who is acting as president of the United States. And when you congregate the president, the vice president, everyone else in the line of presidential succession, and if there were to be an explosion at the Capitol and everyone's killed, someone in the line of presidential succession has to be alive.
Yeah.
In 2007, I was advised by the president's chief of staff that I would be that person. And they gave me a couple of choices about what I could do, and I said, I want to be on this airplane. So I remember arriving at Andrews Air Force Base, and there to meet me was a member of every major department and agency, and they carry these thick binders of classified procedures and protocols to advise me in the event the unthinkable happens at the Capitol. So we take off, and I received a number of classified briefings, and then settled in to watch the president on a monitor. And you know, it really hit me then. I've advised President Bush through 65 state and federal executions, through 2 wars. So I've been involved in some pretty big decisions before, but sitting there, I thought, oh my gosh, if something happened back at the Capitol, would I and this team be up to governing a wounded nation? It was quite a sobering moment. But President Bush finished his speech. As soon as he left the Capitol, we were ordered to return back to Washington. And I tell this story to audiences around the country, and I always conclude by saying that's the closest I'll ever come to being your president of the United States. But it was really, it was a unique experience, and should be reassuring. Well, maybe not reassuring, maybe not, but I think reassuring about the fact that we have plans in place to deal with these kinds of contingencies.
Yeah. Well, Judge, you also helped pass, you know, strengthening our legislation on security, and you know, fought, you know, very much that we needed to get the information that we need, and that was a tough road, because not only you but the president, you know, we're under attack just for trying to, I call it, not necessarily spitting in the hand that feeds you, but spitting at the hand that's trying to keep us safe. And I kind of, in reading through some of Ken's book, I saw that was a very difficult time.
You know, throughout our history, there's always been a back and forth between security and liberty, depending on the circumstances. You know, if we get attacked, most Americans support and favor security, and then as the threats go away, the pendulum swings more towards liberty and privacy. And obviously, we had to make some the president had to make some very difficult decisions in response to the 9/11 attacks, and we had to take some pretty tough measures, and some of them were controversial. I want to tell you, anyone listening to this, that everything we did consistent with what we thought the law allowed us to do. President Bush was very clear in saying we're not going to do anything in violation of the Constitution. So the lawyers worked very hard on issues relating to the war on terror. There are some critics who say that the war was over-lawyered, that the lawyers were too much involved. But we were involved because President Bush wanted to make sure we didn't do the wrong thing in fighting this new kind of war against a new type of enemy. We've never done this before.
Everybody, right?
Absolutely. And so, but yeah, there were controversies, and did we make mistakes? People don't understand how hard these decisions are. And if you don't think a president, an attorney general, whatever, at this level isn't going to make mistakes, you don't have an appreciation how tough this is. Yeah. You're going to make mistakes. Hopefully you can recover from them, you learn from them, and you move on.
Obviously, 2017, you know, you had, and President, again, you know, getting hammered on about a lot of things, but you, in the book, you know, you honorably wanted to go to President Bush and say, hey, I think it's time, you know, for me to exit here. Was that tough?
I think, you know, there's no greater privilege for an American citizen than to go to work every day at the White House. Being the Attorney General and working in the Department of Justice as a lawyer, it's a tremendous privilege to be a member of the President's cabinet, no question about it. But in terms of pure joy and fun, to go to work every day at the White House, to serve a president that you like and you believe in and want to help be successful, it just doesn't get any better than that. So as a lawyer, I have been blessed, I think, to hold the two of the three best jobs in America: White House counsel, Attorney General. I think the third is the Supreme Court of the United States. And so I look back in my life and I think, I'm the only lawyer in the history of our nation who's been both White House counsel and Attorney General, the only Hispanic. Yeah, it's been a good ride. I've enjoyed it. I look back on it with fondness. I miss being involved in those kinds of decisions, but these are not forever, and I appreciate that. But I don't look back with sadness. I look back with just joy, pride that it happened.
That's great.
And grateful that it happened.
That's really powerful what you're saying, because my story is about leaving your life imprint, and part of it is not just the joys of success, but learning from the things that are not successful and realizing God still uses those, right?
Absolutely. And you're going to make mistakes in life, some bigger than others, and you learn from them. And you can't be consumed with defeat or failure. Take it and use it to make yourself better.
Yeah.
And I can't. There are very few things that as a human being you cannot overcome. So I think it's very, very important to remain positive. For me, I'm very optimistic by nature. I'm optimistic about my life, about God's plan for me. I'm optimistic about America, and I think that's important.
Are we safe? Are we safe today? And what are the things that might concern you?
I'm not privy to the intelligence briefings that I used to get every morning as the Attorney General of the United States. But obviously we have some challenges. You look at North Korea, you look at China, you look at Iran. Cyber is a big, big concern. We live in a different world today. When I first went to work for Texas Governor Bush, email was just starting, and I didn't even let him have an email account because we weren't sure how it all would work.
Smart man.
Right.
I want you to me.
So you're right. There's a lot of danger there in the way that we communicate electronically. But anyway, cyber, I think, is the next frontier in terms of where we're going to fight our battles, and I worry about where we are on that. It's a new kind of threat, and hopefully we'll be able to deal with it effectively.
When you look at somebody like you think, well, he'll have no problem getting employment or a job or anything like that. And yet in your book, you all of a sudden you have all these accolades of being the Attorney General, and then all of a sudden, whoa, what do I do now? That was an interesting time in your life, right? And yet there was some men that in a church that kind of ministered to you through that time. You want to share a little bit about that?
Sure. After I left office, there was sort of a dark ages kind of period where I wasn't sure what was next. I went from a life where you're going 100 miles an hour, and all of a sudden it's like zero. You're 5 miles an hour, and I really wasn't sure what I would do next. Wasn't sure whether or not I wanted to practice law, and there were some investigations that were ongoing by the Inspector General at the Department of Justice on some of the decisions that I was involved with. And so, yes, I went to church with a group of individuals, and we were in a men's group, and they were very, very encouraging, and it really gave me hope for my future. But it was probably one of the darkest periods of my life. And in some ways, it's interesting. I kind of felt like I had failed, despite everything that I had accomplished. I felt like my work was not done. And one of the things I really am gratified about what I do today as dean of a law school is I feel like I'm preparing the next generation of leaders. And I talk to them about their opportunities and their obligations as lawyers. And then I want to see them become leaders locally, state, at the national level. And so I'm in a really good place right now.
Yeah, I was impressed that, they called you Al and at the group, the men's group, because it was kind of their way, I think, of saying, hey, you're one of us, and vice versa,
and also remind me, hey, put me in my place. And not that I don't think I needed it, but at the end of the day, I'm just like everyone else. And I need to remember that.
Kind of leading us down, towards the end here. I really, you're an inspiration to me and to so many people by your life story, and leaving imprints just here today. What's the imprint though? There's another part of your life that's very important to you, your wife and your family, and I was very intrigued by that. This how special that relationship is. Tell us a little bit about your family and what kind of imprints they left on your life.
Well, what I've learned is that there's nothing more important than family. There's nothing as satisfying or as rewarding as that loving embrace of a spouse or a joyful hug of a child. There's no prosecution, no case. There's nothing, no job more important than that. It is so vitally important to understand that and appreciate that. And so, obviously, and I'm sure many of your guests have said the same thing, my greatest legacy are going to be my children. And we just found out this past weekend, that I'm going to be a granddad for the first time. And I'd like to think that, I don't know whether I'll be around long enough to influence my grandchild. I don't know whether it's going to be a boy or girl. But, I'd like to think that grandchild is going to know something about me, either directly from me or through my son. And I'll have some influence on that. So obviously, family, legacy, that's the most important legacy. I'm also gratified by the fact that, Neil Gorsuch, who's on the Supreme Court, worked for me at Justice. Brett Kavanaugh, who's been nominated to the Supreme Court, was one of my lawyers in the White House.
I felt good.
The Solicitor General at the Department of Justice was one of my lawyers in the White House.
Wow.
The General Counsel of the CIA, General Counsel at State, they were my lawyers in the White House. That's a powerful legacy.
Wow.
That my lawyers have gone on to do these great things. And then finally, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the influence that I have on the students at Belmont Law School, I think is important. And I'd like to think that someday, one or certainly hopefully more than one, they're going to do some great things in this country.
Yeah. We're sitting in a place that's a legacy place, Dave Ramsey. And I just want to, before we end, just to thank him and all the crew back here, James and all the group back there, amazing people. And but just to say that I knew Dave when he had shag carpet. Okay, he wasn't Dave.
What's
Ramsey.
wrong with shag carpet? Come on, man.
I had shag carpet too. I'm not saying, but what's so great is to see him. To be the Dave Ramsey.
We're Dave Ramsey disciples. We've taken his course. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And, he's just a phenomenal person. We can't be a country in debt. And
that's another big consideration. Absolutely.
And
yes.
And if there's anything that Dave has taught, not only people like me and families that were in debt and getting now out, is that our country needs to realize it's a powerful message to our country too, that we don't, it's a security issue, I would think, that our country needs to remember, and that is to get out of debt and stay out of debt so we can be a prosperous nation. And because all these, I'd hate for all these people, these countries that we owe money to, one that's all of a sudden pay up now. So I'm getting the word out too, as a Dave disciple, to say, hey, we hopefully, people like yourself and others will help us influence our country to do better, with our resources and our things. But we'll see.
I'm with you. I'll do the very best I can. And I agree 100%. I think the deficit, and I'm disappointed in Republicans. At one point, this was a big point for them. And for some reason, I think that we've lost our way, and we need to find our way back.
Yeah. Well, it's an honor to spend some time with you. You're great. You're great as everything, more than I ever thought. But we're very appreciative. The book is called Leaving Your Life Imprint. Attorney Gonzales is without a doubt one of the special people we've met today, and so many great people. But he brought a perspective that, especially coming up to 9/11, that I think all of you that are watching our podcast can really appreciate. And thank you again.
Thanks for having me.
Life Imprints Podcast. Legacy stories that live beyond. Turn up the volume on today's riveting story with your host, Kenny Mauck, at kennymauck.com, and leave your life imprint with your legacy story.